Welcome to Chronicles of Old Singapore. This is Dr. Loh KS, the people's historian. And in this part of Chronicles of Old Singapore, I talk about my own research on the little histories, the lesser known histories of Singapore. So, what we're going to do today is part 3 of the Bukit Swee fire of 1961. So, this is running into a number of episodes, and it's all really to give full context to the history of the fire and why the fire was such a big event in the making of modern Singapore as we know it today. The theme today is a roar from the Kampongs. So previously we saw how the Kampongs were seen as black areas, right? And the thing was, this was not just a label that the British gave or their perception of the Kampongs, but they were trying to do something about it as well. They were trying to remove the black areas. What I'm going to be talking about today is how the fire of 1961 occurred against a backdrop of a battle for housing space in the city in the 1950s. It's important to understand this history so that we can fully appreciate how the fire changed the history of housing in Singapore and Singapore history in general as a whole, actually. So we saw that with the Bukit Swee fire, the fire, right, the naked flame was a threat to the kampong. But just as equally a threat was eviction, being removed from one's house and being forced to leave one's home. The people who were involved in this history as individuals, as families, as communities, the whole village, and as well as political organizations responded to eviction, right? So they were not passive, they responded to eviction. The Nanyang Sangpao said in 1954 a very powerful phrase trying to describe what was happening in the urban kampongs. There was a lion's roar from the oppressed people, right? And it is important to know this history because this is part of the history of how we became a nation. It's part of our political and nationalist awakening. Now, I don't want to go too much into this, but just to say that before the 1950s, before the war, people in Singapore largely accepted the colonial system, right? The war, of course, changed this to a large extent, like a big bang, right? There are many reasons for this, and again, I'm not going to go into detail. There was the Japanese victory over the British, supposedly an impregnable fortress, but it fell after a very brief struggle. And subsequently, the Japanese ruled Singapore for 3 years and 8 months. This Japanese occupation was a huge experience, right? A very traumatic and very defining experience for many of the people in Singapore, as well as a new generation of nationalist politicians in Singapore after the war. Besides this, there were also global events. Anti-colonialism, nationalism, and self-determination were becoming very important for many colonies in Asia and Africa. So there was this wave of anti-colonialism. And one of the waves that was very relevant for the people in Singapore, because 3/4 of Singapore at the time were ethnic Chinese. And in 1949, of course, we know that the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong came to power on the Chinese mainland. And this was very inspirational for many of the Chinese in Singapore, as well as the non-Chinese as well. Now, what has this got to do with housing, right? Because we have to understand how housing was in those days. Housing was not just shelter. Housing is not an asset that people use nowadays to, plan for their retirement or to make profit. Housing was an issue in which one could say, I want to live here. This is the house I want to live in, right? So it was not just shelter, but housing concerned the right to decide where people live. And this is, of course, one of the issues in decolonization and nationalism, the ability and the right to decide where the people lived. So again, we've seen this map a couple of times, and these are the 50-odd urban kampongs in the Singapore city after the Second World War. And these areas, right, these supposedly black areas, was also a place of resistance, a place of turmoil and upheaval after the Second World War, but it was also part of our nationalist awakening. So I'm going to talk about this nationalist history. Again, in the first episode, I showed this photo of the people snatching the hoses away from the firemen to fight the fire at Bukit Swee. And so this is a very nice kind of capturing the kind of relationship between the state, the colonial state, right? These policemen and firemen working for the British colonial government and the people, right? There was a lot of distrust. The roar from the oppressed people can be seen in this photo, right? That people wanted to decide how they're going to fight the fire and also where they're going to live, right? And they didn't trust the colonial state about these things. What were the British doing, right? The British had termed the urban kampongs black areas. They also showed a real interest in the kampongs after the Second World War. And one of the issues that they saw in the kampongs was there was no control. Right, in 1953, the SIT said most of these urban kampongs are a maze of temporary buildings interpenetrated with pathways, development being dense and chaotic. So they didn't like this chaos in the kampongs, that people were building their own housing and the British were not able to control the building of this wooden housing. In 1947, the first post-war housing study of Singapore was undertaken by the British authorities, the Singapore Housing Committee, and he recommended that more information should be gathered, right, to understand the housing crisis in Singapore. 2 years later on, the colonial government set up the Kampong sanitation squads. So this was a very short-lived experiment, right, to try to, have British colonial officials go to the kampongs and try to clean them up. It didn't work because it was very expensive and the British were not willing to commit the resources to it. A year later on, the British decided we are going to ban new wooden huts in the city. All right. So when you see that there is a ban, right, it means that there must be some effort to enforce the ban, or else it's just a piece of document, it's just a voice, right? So what happened subsequently, right? So this is a picture of 3 little pigs, actually 3 huge pigs in one of the kampongs, I think near Bukit Swee. This, I think, before the Second World War. And these are free roaming pigs, right? And they're huge. Look at the bellies of these pigs, and one of the things you can see here is that the pigs are not caged. So they are roaming around in the kampong, right? When I interview people in Bukit Swee, they would tell me the same thing, that people and the pigs live together and they mingled together. So to the British, this was very insanitary, right? That the pigs and the humans were not kept apart. Diseases could be transmitted. In the 1950s, the SIT began to build alternative housing to the kampongs. Right, they call this housing low-cost housing, and some of these famous flats can still be seen in Tiong Bahru, for example, the post-war Tiong Bahru flats. They are smaller than the pre-war ones, but they are very nice, right? People who have gone in there, people who live there would know this. They are currently a place for the yuppies. The British called this the low-cost housing. Actually, they were middle cost, right? Medium cost. But they were not cheap, right? They were meant for the middle class. So the general population of Singapore could not afford the rent. Now, the other thing was that SIT's housing and the kampongs began to compete for housing space, right? Because the SIT will be building their flats in the same areas where the kampongs were growing, right? So, for example, at Tiong Bahru SIT flats, and there was Kampong Tiong Bahru just next to it, Sikating, right? So the SIT tried to do some clearance to remove the wooden houses and the kampongs in places like Queenstown, Henderson, and of course Tiong Bahru itself, but not many, because there were not much of free space left, or the British could not remove the kampongs from those locations. People generally did not want to move to SIT housing, not because they disliked the SIT housing, but because of quite practical and sometimes cultural reasons. First of all, the practical reason, the rent was much higher for a SIT flat compared to a kampong house. The SIT also blamed the locals, right? That people were choosy, So we know that the Chinese believe in feng shui and where the houses would be located, So they felt that people were very choosy about the location of the flat and where the flat was facing. The SIT also blamed the people that there was this horror of isolation and quietness, that people in Singapore did not want to live like isolated from other people and in a quiet housing area, housing block, right? So this is very strange today because this is what we want today, right? But in those days, it was very different. So in Kim Kiat, this is quite a rural area near Toa Payoh. There's a letter that I found in the SIT archives, which really showed the people's perspective rather than the colonial government's perspective. And the letter said, right, in Mandarin, I translate it here: how can you expect us to give up our living system by altering the country life to city life? That is to say, to let the vegetables grow on rocks, right? So this is the language of the farmer, right? Are we now going to grow our vegetables on rocks? How is this good for us? So for those farmers who were living in the city area like Kim Kiat, and there were a number of these farmers, rehousing was not something that they wanted to do. They didn't want to give up farming and move into a flat. Now, something very interesting happened while there was this ding-donging, right, between the SIT and the municipal authorities and the people in the kampongs. The authorities found that they had to do something about it. So they invented this squatter problem, right? They called the people living in the kampongs squatters. Squatters has a number of issues, right? First of all, squatters are illegal occupants, right? They're trespassing on land that they do not have a right. The second thing is squatters don't move, right? So they are obstacle, right? They are obstacle to progress, right? So they are blocking the progress of Singapore. So this was a very powerful way to kind of portray the people as blocking Singapore's progress. Now, we've seen in the previous episode, right, that the people living in the kampongs were, almost all of them, they were not squatters, right, because they paid rent. Almost everyone paid rent, right? I haven't heard of a person living in a kampong or a family living in a kampong that didn't pay rent either to a tenant or to the landowner. But the British continued with their campaign, right, to criminalize, to make illegal the people living in the kampong. In 1955, the British formed a committee, right, a land clearance and resettlement working party to study, investigate, and to plan how to solve this so-called squatter problem. And so here is a map, right? This is from the planning department in 1970. So this is an older map. In the 1960s, of the kampong areas, there are labeled as squatter areas in Singapore, right? You can see a lot of them, not just in the city. The city is sort of around this area, but you can also see these kampong areas in the north and so many of these areas to the east, right? I mean, it's incredible to think that there would be so many squatters. This would be tens of thousands of squatters, if not more, living across Singapore, right? Like tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Singaporeans at the time, right? This is 1960s, are not paying rent. They're just illegally trespassing on people's land or on state land, right? So this was not an accurate presentation of the social situation. Now, from the report of the Working Party on Resettlement and Clearance, more action resulted from the British, right? George Pepler, who was a very famous planning expert from Britain, was invited to Singapore to lead a diagnostic survey officials, the colonial officials, to do a door-to-door survey of the urban kampongs. The first time that many of these colonial officials had ever stepped into the urban kampongs to plan, to map out how many houses there are, how many people are living there, and so what's the condition in these kampongs. The result of this was published a few years later on as the master plan, first proposed in 1955, finalized in 1958 after public consultations. This was a 20-year plan for the development of Singapore, right? Meaning that the housing development, the economic development, the traffic, the infrastructure, now all this would be planned, right? You are not allowed to, do your own thing, build your own house anywhere that you like. If a certain place had been zone for housing, then you cannot build a temple over there, or if a certain place was zoned for a school, you cannot build a house over there, right? Now, some of the features of this master plan, one was to disperse the central area population to new towns outside the city. So you can see here, right, this shows the redistribution of population from the Chinatown area to outside the city. So one of the most obvious ones, Jurong. At the time of the master plan study, there were about 20,000 people living in Jurong. 20 years later, in 1972, there would be 134,000 people living in Jurong. So this is an increase of more than 5 times, right? Another big one would be Bukit Panjang, from 28,000 to 150,000. This would make Bukit Panjang the biggest of the so-called rural areas. Of course, after they have been redeveloped with people moving from the city area, this would no longer be rural, right? There will be new towns. And you can see that there will be this similar kinds of spreading of the people across Singapore as well. So if you look at the urban area, right? So Tiong Bahru, for example, in 1953, there were 98,000 people living in Tiong Bahru. 20 years later, not much change, right? The population would have grown, right, significantly by about 1 million people in 20 years. That was the projection at the time. But the population of Tiong Bahru would remain quite stable. And this is quite largely true. Orchard Road would have grown from 54,000 to 84,000, increase of 30,000. So this is an increase, but not as much as in the rural area. So you can see that the people living in the urban area would be shifted to the places outside the urban area. In the central area, right? So this is the Chinatown area, the central area here. You can see that the population in some cases remained the same, right? And in other places like area M, right, would from 10,000 it will be drastically reduced to 2,000. In some places, the population actually fell because the plan was for the central area, which is very prime land, right, to be given over to business and commercial development and not so much for housing, right? The British didn't want people to live in the Chinatown area of Singapore, right? This is very familiar because this is actually what happened, right? That people will be moved from the city area to outside the city area. I personally live in Woodlands, so this was once upon a time a rural part of Singapore filled with plantations and all that. Now, what about the urban kampongs, which is our main topic today, right? The British policy was very simple. 3 things: containment, contraction, and clearance. The kampongs like Bukit Ho Swee and Tiong Bahru were basically classified as hopeless, right? Insanitary kampongs, and they were to be demolished. So there would be no more efforts to try to clean them up or improve them, but they would be demolished eventually. So the British had big plans. They had the master plans for these urban kampongs. Now, the interesting thing was that the people living in the kampongs did not take this lying down, right? They did not accept the master plan to a large extent. There was kind of personal and family and practical economic reasons why people didn't want to live in the kampongs as well. But this also came together with certain ideas of self-determination, that it is our right to determine where we can live. Right. So I'm just going to talk about two very interesting incidents that happened in the 1950s where people did not accept the master plan. 1953, the SIT sent a squad, a demolition squad, to try to remove 3 families living in a kampong in Geylang, Lorong 27. They went with policemen, right, to kind of escort them and to give a sense of power, but they couldn't do it, right? Because the villagers came together and confronted the officials and told them to leave. And the officials had to retreat, actually. The crowd was becoming very hostile. And eventually, the officials got a riot car dispatched from the police station nearby, which came to restore the order and eventually to carry out the removal of the 3 families. I saw the document for this, the report on this incident. The British official who reported said that the crowd was unruly. There were elements there which were intent on making trouble. I needed a riot car, right? Quite a typical way that the British official would justify what happened, right? And putting the blame on the village. But actually, if you think about it, right, if people's interest and housing was at stake, this was an example of gotong royong, right? The village coming together as a community to protect the interests of its members. 3 years later, something similar happened when the British were trying to remove some houses in Covent Garden, right, which the locals call Hong Lim Pasar, Hong Lim Market, right, and the British sealed the houses, removed the residents, and put some Sikh guards, right, the Jaga, to look over the houses. All right, but the people came back, right? They tore off the seals around the houses and began to try to live there again. And so there was confrontation, right? There was confrontation between the Jaga and the Kampong residents. And women took a very active part in resisting and trying to come back to their houses. An SIT officer was told that he was a European and had no right to issue directions affecting Asians. Right. So this came from a report from the SIT officer, and this is like the closest document I saw, right, that showed the influence of nationalism in the kampongs. The people living in the kampongs were not like uneducated, were not like unruly, out to make trouble, but they were actually aware of the politics going on at the time. We can see this happening in the rest of Singapore on a political and larger scale, right, up to the level of national politics. Politicians and activists in the 1950s began to organize the urban kampongs. There was an organization called the Singapore Attap Dwellers Association, 1952. But the more interesting associations would be formed in the years after the Randall Constitution was implemented. The Randall Constitution gave more leeway, right, for political development in Singapore, for nationalists and politicians to form political parties and so on. And of course, one of these political parties that we know of, which is the government today, was the People's Action Party, the PAP, formed in 1954. 1 year later on, 2 very important associations were formed. The thing is, we have largely forgotten these associations, right? We know that there was the PAP, there was the Labour Front, and then there were the trade unions. Some of the trade unions, you might know, there were the student unions, especially the Chinese school student unions. But an important part of this whole, what was called the mass base, right, of the PAP was the rural associations, the Kampong Associations. So in 1955, the first 2 of these associations were formed, the Singapore Farmers Association and the Singapore Wooden House Dwellers Association. What did they do? These were associations which gave legal advice to the residents. So if people were being evicted, what can they do? Usually people will be very frightened and very worried, and they didn't know what to do. They'd be very confused. So these associations were able to provide legal advice and also to negotiate with the authorities on, what kind of compensation they would have, what kinds of housing or rehousing or resettlement they would have after they move. These associations were also politically active, right? They supported the PAP and the labor and the student unions that were growing at the time. In 1956, in October, there were the rather infamous Singapore riots, the so-called Singapore riots. There's never a proper name for these riots, but there was a huge wave of protests across Singapore, especially involving the Chinese middle school students, right? So here is a picture showing what was a typical scene at the time, right? These are students from Chinese High, which had a very left-wing student population. You can see some of these students are not young at all, right? They were fairly old because the Japanese occupation had delayed their education, and they were confronting the policemen, right? They were linking their arms together in a show of unity. Now, I use this picture also as a way to show that the student unions, the labor unions, the workers, and the rural associations, the people living in the kampongs, the kampong dwellers, the farmers, the wooden house dwellers, were also linking their arms together and ahead of them, right, leading them towards the battle for Singapore's self-determination and eventual independence as part of Malaya was the PAP, right? So that the British thought that these associations were pro-communist, that there were communist elements from the Malayan Communist Party, which was banned at the time, trying to stir up trouble against the colonial government in Singapore. So I think there is some evidence of that, and there were certainly pro-communist elements. Some of these activists and leaders were influenced by events in China. China had gone red in 1949. But also, I think it's important to see that the socio-economic issue was real, right? Housing was a real issue. And the role of this association showed that housing had become of national importance in the politics of Singapore in the 1950s. After these associations were banned, two associations would emerge in their place: the Singapore Country People's Association and the Singapore Rural Residents Association. The names are kind of all similar, right? What was important was that the things that they did, right? Two associations would do things that are very similar, to the two associations before that. They took part in community and social events. So if there are festivals, they helped organize, they took part. They organized the young men to crime patrols. They helped repair wooden houses, roads and bridges, clear the drains, clean the pigsties. They held sports, dance, singing events, sewing classes, kindergartens, literacy classes. So these were events that were addressing some of the issues that the kampongs were facing, right? The poor environment, the lack of sanitation, and also trying to organize the community and make it more lively and make their life better in a sense with culture events and practical workshops and classes and education to some extent. Now, there are two aspects of these community efforts, right? So you can say quite rightly that to some extent these associations were helping to spread communist ideology to the urban kampongs. So I think that has some truth, but that is not all of it. The associations were doing things that were very important that the kampongs needed, right? Because the colonial government was not doing these things. The colonial government had absolutely no presence in the urban kampongs. And you can see later on when the PAP came to power in 1959, one of the first things they did was to set up the People's Association, right? The PAP learned the lesson, right? They realized that you needed the government that could be popular, the government that could be effective, in its policies. They had to have a presence and a positive relationship with the people living in the kampongs. So that's why the People's Association was set up. And these kampong associations also helped contribute to the nationalist awakening of the people, because they brought the ideas of self-determination and the right to determine their own housing among the people living in the kampongs. I think this is the last part I have, and this is like the most political in terms of the electoral politics of Singapore. In 1957, the PAP won the city council elections, and Ong Eng Guan, who was a star in the PAP, People's Action Party, became the mayor of the city. He was the first mayor of the city, and at the time, the city council, we still had the city council. This was a layer of local government of the city area, and the PAP's victory, of course, foreshadowed their victory in the national elections 2 years later on. Ong Eng Guan announced a new kampong policy where the city council government, his government, would give priority to the needs of the people. He promised many things: fire breaks, hydrants, firefighting squads. And that's why we saw the firefighting squads formed afterwards. Standpipes, electricity, sewerage, street lighting and clinics. So these were all the things that were lacking in the kampongs. So improvements were made in a few kampongs on a small scale, but overall, right, this is 1957. It's quite close to the Bukit Ho Swee fire, which is 4 years later on. All these were a little bit too little, too late. Bio Lane and Bukit Ho Swee, these two roads in Kampong Bukit Ho Swee, were not metalled and widened. So on the day of the fire in 1961, the fire engines could still not go inside the kampong, and the water pressure was still not strong enough. So I showed this picture earlier showing the kind of the people fighting the fire. So, this is an example of the firefighting squad, right? They had some basic training as to how to fight a fire. But of course, this is too little, too late, right? The fire has already grown, right, beyond their efforts. So I think this is an interesting topic, right? And this is one of the most interesting parts of the research for me. So there are a number of questions that we can consider, right? If we look at this politics of housing in the 1950s. So one of the questions I would ask, right? And this was quite a controversy at the time. When the SIT squad, right, is going to demolish houses in the kampong, should the police accompany the team inside the kampong, right? Think about this, okay? Because let's say if the demolition team, had no police escort, they would be threatened, and sometimes they will be assaulted actually by the people who live in the kampong. So, but if the police would go with them, what would happen? In many cases, the city council found that when the police accompanied the demolition squads, this in fact created more trouble, right? Because it heightened the tension, right? Why are these people coming with police inside my community, right? So this actually inflamed the tensions, right? So think about this. This is quite interesting historical controversy. The other thing I would encourage you to think about is the city council's new kampong policy. The new kampong policy only had a time of like 3 years or so because once the PAP came to power, the city council was abolished, right? And we only had one government, the central government of Singapore. But if the city council had survived, had gone on to implement the kampong policy, would the kampongs have had a chance, right, to be cleaned up, right, to be made safe from fire? The third thing I would say, it was very interesting reading the SIT documents on the things happening in the kampong, right? And this is where, historians have to encounter the source and figure out, is this source reliable? Is this source written from whose perspective, right? So I often had to read the colonial sources against the grain to write the social history of Singapore, to write the social history of the Bukit Ho Swee fire. So like just now, the incident at Geylang Lorong 27, right, where the demolition team faced off against the hostile crowd, the whole report was written from the perspective of the SIT officer who was trying to, avoid being blamed, right? Because he had led a team inside the kampong, and then he caused a lot of tensions and it almost became a riot. So he was trying his best to say, it's not my fault. I didn't get enough support. You didn't give me a riot car. You given me a riot car in the beginning, it would have solved the problem, right? So it's a very kind of a militaristic policing kind of perspective, and you have to use some common sense in this kind of situation, right? If you had brought a riot car into the kampong, maybe this time it would have worked. But if you continue to do so, the riot cars would not have solved the problem, because the problem is a political problem at the heart of it, and is about the trust between the state and the people in the kampong. So you can't just read sources uncritically, literally. You have to read them in the context, and I read them against the grain, right? Against the grain. So in conclusion, the Bukit Ho Swee fire took place against a background of growing conflict in the black areas. Right? It's important to understand this context. And housing had become a key issue in Singapore's political history, in Singapore's decolonization and nationalist awakening. And there's one more thing to go, right? Which is the fires. The fires and the housing were tied together, right? And fires in the urban kampongs inflame the issue, right? No pun intended. And in the next episode, we'll be talking about the other fires of Singapore, which led to Bukit Ho Swee in 1961. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to the channel and look out for the next episode. Thank you. Bye.